Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the 177th episode of Stories of Service, where we are going to discuss a very serious topic, and that is the topic of command investigations within the United States military. And as I said in my show notes, this is a show that I wish I didn't have to do. This is a show where I wish the process for these command investigations provided due process and provided a fair way to adjudicate issues. But unfortunately, myself and many others, we do believe the command investigation system is absolutely broken. And if no one else is going to step up to fix it, we're just going to keep talking about it. And so today, that's what we're going to do. We're going to shine a light on the harm that it causes directly from those who have lived it. But before we get started, as I always do, I want to go ahead and introduce the Stories of Service podcast with an introduction from my father, Charlie Pickard.
From the moment we're born and lock eyes with our parents, we are inspiring others. By showing up as a vessel of service, we not only help others, we help ourselves. Welcome to S.O.S, Stories of Service, hosted by Teresa Carpenter. Hear from ordinary people from all walks of life who have transformed their communities by performing extraordinary work.
And it is our love for the military that compels us to speak up. All of us that you'll meet here today believe in accountability, justice, and taking care of our own. And today we're going to hear from two individuals with firsthand accounts from who are survivors of sexual assault, harassment, and bullying. And we're not going to just talk about what happened to them. We're going to talk about the systematic failures that followed, focusing on three major issues: lack of adequate legal aid. We believe that victims and complainants often face an uphill battle and do not get the proper legal support. We're going to talk about the systemic vulnerabilities, how administrative, investigatory, and punishment tools are misused and weaponized. And lastly, we'll get into the command incentives to dismiss complaints, why substantiating complaints is often against a command's interest. And while my guest experiences will be deeply personal and painful, this isn't just about their individual stories. The real story is what happens afterwards, which is the betrayal by the Department of Defense and the Coast Guard leadership when they do not act with integrity, accountability, and justice. And as all these shows are, these shows will be the opinions and the beliefs of myself and our guests. We are speaking for ourselves and not on behalf of any other entity. And my first guest that I will introduce to the podcast is Krista Gunsley. Krista, how are you doing today?
Well, how are you? Thanks for having me.
Hello. And I'm also going to introduce retired Lieutenant Colonel Francesca Graham. Francesca, how are you today?
I'm awesome, Teresa. Thanks for having me on the show.
Awesome. So first off, I'm going to read you guys a little bit about Krista, and we're going to go get into her story. Krista Gunsley is a Tennessee native and a graduate of Liberty University. She enlisted in the U.S. Navy as an electronics technician in 2009 and later commissioned as a cryptologic warfare officer in 2013. Throughout her career, she has held multiple leadership roles across shore and sea assignments. Ashore, she was served as the Senior Watch Officer, Cryptological Readiness Action Officer Training Lead, Administrative Department Head, Joint Information Planners Course Instructor, and SIGET Program Manager. At sea, she was the Information Operations Principal Assistant, preparing the crew for operational readiness across multiple warfare areas. After experiencing sexual assault, harassment, discrimination, and bullying, she became a passionate advocate for resilience, mental health awareness, and leadership rooted in empathy. She is dedicated to fostering safe spaces for open dialogue and support within both the military and civilian communities. Her decorations include 3 Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medals, the Navy and Marine Corps Achievement Medal, the Navy Good Conduct Medal, and various unit awards. She's also a devoted wife and proud mother to their 9-year-old son and 2 beloved dogs. Lieutenant Colonel, retired, Francesca Graham enlisted as an E1 in the Navy in 1997 before matriculating to the United States Military Academy at West Point. She graduated from West Point in 2004 and was commissioned into the Army as a military intelligence officer. She is a senior jump master, has earned 3 master's degrees, appeared on numerous podcasts, including my own as a returning guest, published weekly articles demanding greater accountability and transparency in the Department of Defense and Coast Guard through her newsletter, the DoD Times Redacted, and also through the Star Chamber podcast, which I am a loyal listener. She has deployed twice to Iraq, is the first woman and first intelligence officer to serve as the G5 Chief of Plans for the, is it 18th Marine Corps? 18th Marine Corps, I can read.
18th Airborne Corps.
18th Airborne Corps, sorry, and served as the aide-de-camp to the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. She joined Walk the Talk Foundation, which we'll talk more about, in June 2024, and is currently serving as their Chief Operating Officer and Chief Advisory Officer. Her awards and honors are commensurate with her sacrifices and years in service to our great nation. Welcome, Francesca.
Thank you, Teresa.
So first off, Krista, I want to get into what inspired you to join the Navy.
Honestly, I joined the Navy because it's, obviously I didn't have like a background like Francesca. I was actually homeless. I was a college dropout. It was back in 2009, and that's when the economy just took a tank, and I just didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. And I ended up living in my car and working at a facility where essentially I just taught mental health patients how to just take care of themselves. And a recruiter found me in my car and tapped on my window and asked me, do you want to get out of here? Do you want to live in your car for the rest of your life? I can show you a new life. And I told him, absolutely not. And so
Wow.
I said, absolutely not. And because honestly, I was a military brat my whole life. And, but I knew that I couldn't stay there. And so after a couple of weeks, he brought me a Subway sandwich, MM1. He brought me a Subway sandwich a couple of times, and he kind of figured it out. And I just said, okay, fine. Let me see what the Navy has to offer me. I've never have heard of, heard of I've heard of the Navy, but never really, my parents were Army and Air Force, so I didn't really know too much about it. And I said, well, it's different than Army and Air Force. I know about that. And so he shipped me off to to MEPS, and that's all she wrote. So I went from homeless to homeowner, and that's why I joined.
That is amazing. What an amazing story. Well, Francesca, over to you to tell our audience, especially the ones who did not watch our first podcast together, a little bit about your journey and where you were born and raised and what inspired you to enlist into the United States Army.
No, thank you, Teresa. Yeah, no, I was born in California, raised in Washington State, and I joined the Army, not the Navy.
I know, two Navy, one Army today.
In 1997 when I was 17 years old. And I think the main reason I joined the Army was because I was not sure what I wanted to do with my life. And I thought it was a good decision. And I freely admit that I was window shopping when I went to the recruiting building. I walked in, the Navy recruiter was a little bit obnoxious, so I kept on walking. The Air Force recruiter was a little bit wayfish looking, so I kept on walking. And the Navy recruiter was just didn't look terribly impressive in my 17-year-old eyes. And then I walked into the Army office, and this fellow said hello, said, "Hi, I'm Sergeant First Class David A. Smith. How can I help you?" And I was like, you know what? I think I'm going to join the Army. And the rest is history.
That's amazing. And both of you have had such amazing careers. We definitely want to also give a shout out to Mandy Fight. She says, "Hi, friends." So she is on the call and watching. Mandy is one of the lead parents and advocates for the Red Hill water crisis. And of course, I've had her on as a previous guest. So hello, Mandy, and glad you're on the call. So we're going to just get right into it because we've got a limited amount of time, and we're really here to discuss this issue with command investigations and command climate and how these investigations do not always guarantee a due process. So to start with, Krista, I know this is your first time sharing this story, and I want you to take me back to your first experience with these command investigations and what you expected and then what you got. So over to you, Krista.
Right. So, to answer your first question, is just what I expected. So, first and foremost, um, I just lived and died by what was in black and white. I said, okay, so what is in black and white, we are definitely going to follow. So, I made sure that, I knew everything. OpNav 5354 attack one hotel. I read that cover to cover. And I expected for my leaders, especially the SIMEO, which is the Command Manage Equal Opportunity Officer. I expected them to adhere to that because that's what they went to school for. That was what they were at the command for. And unfortunately, I saw a lot of um, severe lack of procedural compliance. And then I saw situations that arose where essentially, the phrase is that, you're guilty till proven innocent. I felt that in my cases is that they tried everything impossible to essentially, the system was essentially rigged to deter me from reporting. It was just that we don't want to deal with this problem, make it go away. And so to me that was the most hurtful, because coming from the enlisted ranks, there's this overall feeling that you feel when, especially, I remember when I was at E4 and trying to become an officer, I would stand beside this um, coffee shop that it was essentially it was kind of like this little coffee cart, that a lot of officers would frequent at Naval Base Coronado. And I would just remember going out there in the morning, and I would actually, like, in my remembering how I was when I was homeless, I would ask some of the officers, "Sir, ma'am, can I buy your cup of coffee so that way I could maybe have 5 minutes of your time? I'm trying to become an officer just like you." And essentially I was doing the same thing when I was even with my cases. Can I just get 5 minutes of your time so that way you can, I'm trying to get a status update. Can you help me? I'm trying to do this. Okay, per the instruction, you're supposed to
Mm-hmm.
submit an OPREP every 14 days. Like, why is this OPREP not sent out? You're supposed to update me. You haven't been doing this. And that to me was just kind of hard because, at that time I was a lieutenant, and I just kind of felt that, well, what are the junior sailors having to do? Like,
Yeah.
it was, and that to me, that bothered me the most. And so when it came to my cases, I was just, and then when I brought it up to my leadership, because I even requested, not I requested both admirals mast multiple times to tell them about the failures of their program. And I said, this is a failure. We're failing our sailors. We're failing our shipmates because we're not following procedures. And when I would bring it up to them, it was more of an annoyance to them that I would bring up these concerns. And it was more of kind of, and then it also felt that it was more of a knack where, oh, here she goes again, here she goes again. And I'm just like, and it was really disheartening. And just to bring it up to you, I wanted to share the opening line to when my cases were transferred over, because as you know, from all nav 24 TAC 22, that the higher echelon has to now take on sexual harassment cases. And so the opening line that my commanding officer wrote when she had to transfer the cases over, which I had to then tell my commanding officer, you have to transfer these. This is a sexual harassment case. You're not supposed to handle this. You're supposed to adhere to the ALNAV, because she herself wanted to handle these cases herself. And the opening line that was in there was just that on August 2021, Lieutenant Gonzalez was passed over for promotion. On 18 November 2021, Lieutenant Gonzalez attempted suicide. Now, the opening statement, that's the statement that grasped the audience. And so, and to me, I just kind of felt that this was all meant to just discredit me.
Right. It wasn't even about your case or about what you complained about. Like, they didn't start with what was the original problem. And we're going back in time to, I think, if you can correct me if I'm wrong, about 3 years ago, about 2 or 3 years ago, when you made a complaint, and you basically had a workplace dispute. So we'll start with that.
Mhm.
And
Yes, ma'am.
you tried to get this workplace dispute adjudicated through an investigatory process.
Mm-hmm.
And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I recall when we talked about this, they didn't even do the preliminary inquiry
No, ma'am.
correctly.
No,
Tell me a
ma'am.
little bit about that.
So no, ma'am. So when it came to the preliminary inquiry, so like I stated before, that's supposed to be handled by the ISIC, so an echelon higher than your command. So when I first went to my chief of staff, I told him about the issues that I was having. I said, "This is what's going on." He immediately then told me, um, essentially went into immediately into reprisal and bullying. And, oh, do you not know what this person's going through? You need to not do this or I will burn you. And I just said, excuse me. And so he never even investigated it, never even, like, where at the first instant, like, that's protected communication. I'm coming to you, sir, with a problem. You are immediately supposed to act. That's your charge. Take your personal feelings about this individual out of it. I don't even care if you guys if you golf together on the weekend, if you go to the same church, or if your wives are friends, it doesn't matter. You are immediately supposed to investigate that. A PIO is supposed to be started. He did not. He stripped me of my collateral duties. He then told me, and then he immediately went in to say, and then tried to, in a roundabout way, tried to punish me for an act that he thought I did, but it turned out that because I'm a meticulous record keeper, I said, no, I did not do that, sir. That was not me. And then and then he went and immediately said, oh, well, you know what he's going through because of whatever reason that he did. So then he didn't even start the investigation. So I had to actually wait until he left from that position, till his relief came, and then I went to the next person. But it wasn't even that I had to go to the next chief of staff. I had to go the roundabout way to then go through the chief's mess. Then the chief's mess was able to then help me talk to the new chief of staff to then get the investigation started. To where I was like, why do I have to go outside of the wardroom to then get these investigations investigated and adjudicated?
And I want to pull Francesca into this because this is a good point about when an officer has a dispute and the closeness that that officer might have with the triad or with the chain of command. And tell me a little bit about, is that something that you see common where it's sometimes even harder for the officers to get resolution or to be able to work through their cases?
I wouldn't say so, Teresa, actually.
Okay.
I would almost err on the side that without having exact data to give you. So with Walk the Talk Foundation, we have advised roughly 450 currently serving former service members who've been going through these administrative processes, punishing processes. And we have seen a very healthy mix of enlisted and officers who have reached out to our foundation for help. And across the board, whether enlisted or officer, the administrative system, whether it's the punishment, and I say punishment because the DoD likes to break it into a quote non-punitive or punitive administrative punishment, but it's all punitive regardless. Or the investigatory system itself, across the board, whether enlisted officer or warrant officer, it's an unjust and opaque process that is completely lacking in due process.
Wow. So you finally get this investigation back to you, Krista, and the second person, the chief of staff, takes this investigation, and so now you're like, okay, they're going to look at this case. They're going to uh, nominate an investigating officer. They're going to do interviews with witnesses. This is going to go in a certain direction. How do you feel it went after that point?
So even after that point, um, so it still was an issue because of two reasons. So one, they didn't adhere to the all nav 24 TAC 22, which it was supposed to go to the ISIC. So it should have went to the higher echelon command. And then two, there
Because of
was
the
no
nature of the complaint. Yep.
right? And then it should have also, adhered to timelines. So for sexual harassment complaints, 30 days. If it's going to be longer, they need to then tell you, okay, and then you have to go back and they're supposed to be feeding you paperwork saying, okay, this, we had to request an extension and this is why, because of XYZ. There was nothing of the sort when it came to extensions or anything else. And then I also would say there was a complete, I would say there was complete, conflict of interest and bias when it came to a lot of the investigators because they were at the command that I was in. So you have essentially O 06 investigators, like essentially trying to, investigate another O 06. So which usually you're supposed to go higher than that. And so, or be outside of the organization if it's, according to the 7050 tax 01. So that's where I was just kind of looking at them and I'm like, this is not right. I said, why? And then at the same token, my point of contact is the Simeo. So I'm going back to them and I'm saying, well, why is this not being adhered to? Why is this? I'm reading the instruction, I'm showing them this is not being adhered to. And they were, and the Simeo was just a little bit gun shy because of the ranks of the people, of the investigators and of the chief of staff. And then they felt like not so empowered because of, usually they're an E7 or above, so usually, senior enlisted person. So I kind of was just, thinking to myself, well, you have positional authority, you should have, according to the instruction, you should have an unimpeded access to the CO. So if they're not following, pay attention, get this job done correctly. But it
Correct.
still wasn't done correctly. And so, but I would even say, and I even heard this from multiple attorneys, because after a while I had to hire my own attorney. And
I
so,
mean, that's what we're also getting into right now is
mhm,
during this call. And I want to just stop there, just
mhm,
pause on the fact that you said you had to hire an attorney and turn this over to
mhm.
Francesca. So a lot of people will say, well, wait a minute, doesn't Defense Region Legal Services, can't you just go to your base legal office and consult? But people will think that people that don't understand administrative investigations or they're new to the process, they'll say, okay, I could just go over to base legal. I can talk to a JAG. Tell us, Francesca, why that might not be the case.
Yeah, no, that's it's quite the conundrum, isn't it? So that the DoD and the Coast Guard, they encourage their service members and their federal civilians to report wrongdoing, and they really sell it as, you're taking care of the organization. Don't never walk past a piece of trash. If you see something, say something.
Sure.
And then what you find once you say something, because you've either seen something or experienced something, like Krista and myself and many others, is that you are entirely alone. You have no advocate, and you are not provided any sort of legal counsel by either the Department of Defense or the Coast Guard. So as a whistleblower, you are not entitled to any sort of legal support at all. And when we say whistleblower, I just want to make sure that it's clear for our audience that that has slightly different meanings if you're talking a military person versus a federal civilian or contractor, et cetera. For a military person, I'll start with a distinction first with federal civilian. If you're a federal civilian, you are a whistleblower if you make a protected communication about certain things, like very, very specific things. As a military person, if you make a protected communication, meaning you speak to someone in your chain of command about anything, whatever that thing is that you think is wrong, you are now a whistleblower as a complainant. And as I said, you have no legal support within the system, or even for Krista and for any other survivors in the DoD or the Coast Guard of either sexual assault or sexual harassment. But I'll speak specifically to sexual assault. There's a lot of people who believe that if you are a victim of sexual assault, an investigation occurs, and say the person that you made the complaint against or who's the alleged offender is taken to a court-martial, non-judicial process, whatever it is, there's an assumption made that you as the victim are given what's called special victim counsel, and therefore you are actually provided counsel. But that is not true. that is not actually the person who will serve as your legal advocate in the courtroom in the adversarial process that is a court-martial hearing, where you have lawyers pitted against lawyers. In fact, that special victim counsel, their sole purpose, and I'm speaking specifically for sexual assault, their only purpose is to, quote, help you navigate the system, essentially almost to be like a legal social worker, but they have no right to actually defend you in the system. So you are alone. You have no advocate, and you are pitted. Ryan, our president and founder of the Walk the Talk Foundation, Ryan Swayze, we would say you are intentionally pitted against the entire system of the United States government that you were encouraged to report to because you never walked past a piece of trash.
Right. You were encouraged to report the wrongdoing. And also, can you touch briefly on, because I know a lot of my audience will want to know this issue too, about how this might even go both ways to people who are accused of something from someone. Do they get any special protection?
Can you ask that question again?
So let's put it on the other thing where you're not the person with the complaint, but somebody has a complaint against you. So someone is complaining about you and your leadership, your treatment of them. Do the person who's the accused, do they get any protection?
I will say yes. You get there. Each of the services, including the Coast Guard, have defense councils, regional defense councils, area defense councils, etc. District support office for Coast Guard. I would caveat that, though, heavily with saying that certainly in the Army, and I believe in the Air Force as well, but I might be wrong, but certainly in the Army, the person who is the senior rater, so the senior most person on your performance evaluation for all of the judge advocate generals that sit in that defense counsel office, is the senior defense counsel for the installation. Who is the rater for the senior defense counsel for the installation? The installation commander. So where the advertisement is that this defense counsel is independent and they'll help you and all these other things, that's really not true. Furthermore, within the Department of Defense and the Coast Guard, unique from the civilian legal system, your judge advocates general, they are not typically solely defense counsels or solely prosecution counsel. I'm not quite sure the right word for that.
Right. They're not expertise in one or the other.
Well, they're neither expertise per se, but they're also neither biased in a way per se, right? So defense counsels, that takes a special type of person who is able to look at the law and look at the body of procedural law and say, okay, was the procedure violated? Discount for a second guilt or innocence.
Right.
The American judicial system was designed specifically to weight guilt or innocence less than was the process followed correctly. And if I could just very briefly, because we talk about due process, but we don't really define due process. So Fifth Amendment of the American Constitution says that no one shall be deprived, it says to the federal government that no one shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Okay, it's a little bit of a circular argument there, right? So there's a lot of precedent of Supreme Court case decisions, federal court case decisions that help to define this thing called due process of law. In summary, though, it's that all levels, this is Cornell Law School, all levels of American government must operate within the law, legality, and provide fair procedures. So when you're looking at this whole process of this system within the military that quite literally deprives you of life and liberty and property long term, especially if they could administratively separate you without ever showing you the evidence of why that administrative separation occurred, none of that follows the law and certainly is not a fair procedure.
Absolutely. And I think that what is also important to understand in these processes is that these things have life or death consequences. As Krista said, I mean, this had a severe impact on your mental health. And tell us a little bit, Krista, about that issue, not just how you had the dispute with this person, but then the moral injury of how this impacted your mental health trying to navigate this process.
Mm. So it's so twofold. So one, it's just, you're going against this really robust organization with a supreme legal team. So you kind of feel like, a child, it's kind of like a JV trying to play on varsity. You're just like, there's just no way that I'm going to I'm going to navigate through this. And so, and one thing that I found was interesting is that the JAG officer for that S2 command, I wrote him a question, and I asked him just one simple question as far as that, well, what is happening with my other formal EO complaints? And his response was, I strongly recommend you consult with legal counsel. That's what he wrote me back, and I have the evidence here. And the part that was so interesting about that, and that talking about mental health, was just that, so for me, it was kind of like a lot of like mind tricks and mind manipulation that I felt was played against me during that moment, because I was just that I said, that I don't really understand the legal process too well. I don't have a law degree, and then two, so finding a lawyer within the local area that can practice military law is quite a journey. And so I found a total of five, and to date I've spent $18,000 in legal fees, and that I will probably never get back. And so that contributed to my mental health decline, given the fact that I'm dumping out all this money. So yeah, so when it comes to my mental health, it was a struggle, and a lot of people ask me like, why did you um one of the questions that even my therapist, like, why do you feel that you want to give up on life? And I read this quote recently that I wanted to read and share it. And it says, I said, when we place our hope in influences, what we place our hope and as like what we place our hope in influences our ability to endure difficult times. If we cling to something that is taken from us, our lives will crumble. And I placed a lot of my hope in the Navy. Given the fact that I was homeless, I felt that this was my last take on life to be successful. So everything I did in the Navy, I wanted to do my absolute best job. It was just, even when I went to college, when if every assignment that I've ever done, I've always gave 110%. And so, and to see that that was the thanks that I received when when somebody harmed me, and it was just that all my efforts just seemed that it was all in vain. So that just really just made me feel that. And then also in my, I just remember in my OCS package, I looked at officers as visionaries, and as I looked up to these people, and to see how the wardroom just turned their back on me, and during this time, and not
Yeah,
just even my offenders, but it was even just even my mentors. I've had issues with, I reach out to some mentors, and I would tell them the certain things. And as soon as you tell other people that, oh, I have an issue, it's kind of like you have that stink on you where they're like, get away from me, because I don't want to ruin my paper. So I can't be around you because you're complaining. Do you know how awful that is when
that's
you're
like so isolating. It's like you're basically blocked from your tribe because your tribe
exactly
is the military. And then all of a sudden you're the person speaking up and speaking out. And so people don't want anything to do with you. And
right?
Francesca, I know you said you've experienced that as well when you were going through your case, correct?
Oh yeah, no, it was pretty tough. But to be honest, with my case, with my peers, many of my peers, and several of the folks that have worked with me, plus just a really large group of people that I've built up as friendships and strong professional relationships over the last 20 something years, there were quite a few people who could see how blatantly ridiculous the allegations were that were made against me in reprisal for having made a complaint against my boss. So yeah, and but just a couple points I wanted to touch on that Krista was just commenting on. The first one is moral injury. We've heard this term quite a bit over the last several years, and it's really picking up speed, which I think is very good. With moral injury, Francesca, loosely defined, is when you, as Krista was saying, you have placed your faith into something, and not just that you've placed your faith into something, but that thing, the leadership of the Department of Defense and the Coast Guard, has told you and has convinced you that they can trust you, or excuse me, that you can trust them. And not only that, but have told you that they are going to mold you into models of themselves, people who believe, from the West Point perspective, duty, honor, country. And then, like in Krista's case, and so many cases that we see with our foundation, in my case and in Ryan's case, at the point that you are all of a sudden in need of help because something happened, or you are being reprised against because you made a complaint, all of a sudden you realize, Ryan said this during a podcast with one of our fellow podcasters, Corey Weathers. It's one of my favorite podcasts that he's ever
Corey's
done.
great.
Yeah, she's just phenomenal.
I need to listen to that show that she did
Oh
with
yeah,
Ryan.
it's a really good show. He
Okay.
said that, and I don't know if he trademarked this, but this is where I heard it. He said that people are more willing to give up their lives than to give up their careers. And so when you ask someone, just Krista, as you said, all of a sudden you get the stink on you of having an investigation against you, or having made a complaint and then being reprised against, i.e. have an investigation against you or whatever it is. A lot of people will go into their holes. You'll be isolated, you'll be ostracized, or as one of our clients for the foundation was told, she was told by a person who's outranks her 3 times over, don't bother going up on the 3rd deck. Nobody likes you up there. So, I mean, that's pretty terrible. That's pretty awful.
My God. And that's that piece that, like, it just exasperates the mental health issues. And then there's even, and we don't really have to go into it too much, but behavior health is often weaponized against the complainant, because then people will say, well, no, you're paranoid, you're this, you're that, you need to go to behavior health. And it's like, well, maybe I need to go to behavior health because you guys have isolated me and took me away from my tribe, and now I'm an outcast. And I think there's a lot to be said for that, Krista. And I know you experienced that isolation firsthand. So take me back a little bit to your case. So the new chief of staff is in place. They've passed it on to the next higher up, ISIC. And my understanding is this case drug on for, I want to say, years. Like, this wasn't, or at least multiple months before it was adjudicated. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am. Yep, that's exactly what happened. So it went to the higher echelon. And so by this point, it took upwards of a year. So being the fact that there was just so many instances where I just was writing MFRs due to the overall lack of procedural compliance. And I think I actually can show you. I have my box. It's but I have a whole
I'll full
whole
screen
box.
you right here.
It's like this entire box is full of 1,500 pages of evidence that I have kept. And 1,500 pages of MFRs that I wrote. And that's just sheer anxiety. I just had to just keep writing because no one would listen, no one would take any time. So yes, when it went up to the ISIC, I
And
saw
that's
the
the higher
same.
level echelon command, for those of you who don't know what ISIC stands for. Basically, her command didn't take it. The command that's in charge of that command took over the investigation.
Yep. And so with that, they took it over. They took over the case, and it was a repeat of from my command, where the same instances were happening. The Simeo wasn't doing his job. There was timelines were not being met. Op reps, like operational reports, were not being sent out. per the instruction. I saw that, and then but by this time, because it was at a on a larger scale, that it was so blatantly obvious that they weren't adhering to policy. I just said, okay, I'm now going to file an IG complaint. And the part that really stuck out to me was that when I is that the IG, the person that was nominated to be my investigator for IG, the commander over the ISIC then told her that she was going to then be the PIO, which, in accordance with DODI 7050 Tag 01, and I read, it says, in all matters relating to investigative work, personnel and organizations conducting the inquiry must be independent, but both in fact and appearance. Individuals assigned to conduct and review the hotline inquiry must be outside the immediate chain of command. So, and she said nothing, and the CO had direct access to her. He told her how to run her investigation. He told her what to look into. Out of all the witnesses that I gave her to keep, that I told her to look into, she looked into 2 out of the 16. So I said improper exclusion of evidence. So there was obviously some biases and conflict of interest there.
Mhm. And
So
that's an
it was,
interesting counterpoint. I don't mean to interrupt, but I
oh, go
just want
ahead.
to stay on this. And by the way, we have a few people on here that are very dear friends of mine and dear friends of the podcast. I just want to say, give a shout out here to Bill Brown. He was my boss when it came to the Navy SEAL March, and he says stay strong. And he's also a whistleblower in his own right. And he said having the courage to speak up is one of the first steps to positive change. Ethan Perkins really centered in on what Ryan said about how people are more willing to give up their lives and their careers. And it is true. Very, very true. Linda Parnell Taylor, she also has a story to share. I've been meaning to get back to her. I know she's emailed me and she's on the call as well. And then my very dear friend, Sandy Duchak, who's a veteran nonprofit, Veteran Sisters, I'll be working with very soon. So stay tuned for that announcement. And she said, I'm not surprised this happens at a certain base. I won't say it out loud. For those of you who are on the voice, I'm trying not to use command names. I'm trying not to use the names of things, and practicing that higher level of discretion that I know is so important. But to get back to what I wanted to center in on when it came to what you just said, Krista, is the fact that, and I hope I didn't lose my train of thought. I'm very famous for doing that. But it's this idea that even if the higher level echelon takes the investigation and it has this look of being more objective, they still choose the witnesses. And Francesca, I want you to go into why that is so important. Like, why is it so important that witnesses from both sides be consulted?
$10 million question right there, Teresa.
Oh yeah.
So one of the great things, and by great there's a heavy dose of sarcasm in there. One of the great things about the administrative processes within the Department of Defense and the Coast Guard is that the appointing authority or the convening authority is the judge, the jury, the executioner, the inspector, police, essentially, the lawyer, the defense lawyer, the prosecution, all in one. It's a very convenient system. It cuts
no
down
conflict there.
It cuts down a lot of time. You don't have to worry about an adversarial process where you have evidence and all this stuff. So you have this thing where someone makes a complaint and goes to either the inspector general. If the inspector general, if it should go to the inspector general, at least if it deals with fraud, waste, and abuse, restriction, or reprisal. If it doesn't, which is the vast majority of cases, then it will go back down to the exact command wherein that problem is theoretically occurring. And that's your first conflict of interest it's your second, because of course the IGs are rated by the commanders, of course. But ignoring that for a second. So it'll go down, the complaint will go down to the command. The command will decide, the commander will decide the scope of the investigation, will decide who is going to do the investigation, and will decide what questions he wants
Investigating officer to ask.
he wants the investigating officer to ask. And as you can imagine, the outcome of those investigations, not always, this is not an indictment on every single person, but the system is designed in such a way that the outcome of those investigations yield themselves to answering the questions that exactly the commanders want, whether that has to do with the complaint or not. And also whether it has to do with justice or not. As we saw with the case with Captain Brad Geary.
Yep. And Ryan, by the way, is on the call, and he even brought up the Brad Geary thing. He
yep.
said,
"Oh yeah, there you go, absolutely."
There you go. Events, Crozier relieved, Red Hill, Brad Geary.
Exactly. So the investigation, if the initial investigation results do not yield what the commander wants to see, what can the commander do? Or in Brad Geary's case, I think it was the vice chief of naval operations, they can just have start a new investigation with a different scope. And
that's what happened with Crozier. The CNO wanted to drop the case, and somebody above him said, "Nope, not dropping it. We need to get rid of him." And so they rescoped and rewrote the investigation to have a different outcome. And that, to be honest with you guys, that was that case, the Crozier case, was my first peek behind the curtain to go, what's going on here? Like, I didn't even understand this issue. I didn't have a podcast at the time, none of that. And I had no idea when that case was going on. But having read about it and seeing the way that it flip-flopped in the media, where the CNO was going to reinstate Crozier, and then the CNO didn't reinstate Crozier, and I was like, what's happening here? And so that was sort of my first little inkling that this system might not be very fair. And then it just kept going. I just kept hearing case after case, like you said, Red Hill, Crozier, your guys' cases. And now, I mean, I've probably done about 20 of these cases on my podcast, I would say, maybe more. And every time I do them, I'm just like, when is someone going to fix this? And so, Krista, let's wrap your case up. And then I definitely want to talk solutions towards the end of the call. So, Krista, what ended up happening with this one particular case that we're talking about?
So I ended up, because of them utilizing the IG investigator as also the command PIO, I filed Article 1150s against all the COs.
Which is a complaint. It's an official complaint
of wrongs. Yes, correct. And so, which went up to the higher echelon and to their bosses, which I received a response that said, and their boss said, one of their bosses, so it went up to one boss, and one of their bosses said, "I can't control every program. I'm too busy," pretty much. That's what he said.
I shouldn't be laughing at you, Krista, but
I know. I mean, what can you do?
The conflict of interest, right? Like, people are like, "Oh, Article 138, they work." And it's like, no, they don't. They work if it's like, it's if you can get the quick wins, right? Everyone likes their quick wins. But if you're dealing with something like what you're talking about, complex issues that involve leadership failures, especially somewhat to your point earlier, Teresa, about officer leadership failures, what does a senior officer ranks do? They
protect their own.
Yeah. But they don't. This is the issue. It's accountability. There's none. That's what my issue is. Now, if you're a junior sailor, now when I was in E4, and like, there was always open mass. If I was E4 and got a DUI, oh yeah, to the blue line. They would tell you in front of all your shipmates and everything else, and they would put you out there on public display. But why don't they do the same thing? Like, why is there this protection amongst like the officer ranks and senior leadership?
And that's honestly why I've told you guys before that this is a system where I can't feel safe in it anymore. And it's definitely influencing my decision to retire as soon as I can, because I don't feel safe operating in a system where there's no procedure especially for, like you say, for officers. I do believe, Francesca, from what I've seen, that the enlisted do have a little more of a justice process because they're far from removed from these situations. But I couldn't begin to really understand it, Francesca, because I haven't seen it from your side, from a client side, or from how maybe the senior enlisted are doing the same things, or the chiefs are doing the same things. I don't know, because I'm not in that world. I can only tell you the cases that I've seen from the officer side. And it's exactly what you said, Krista. It's created a system where we, in these field grade levels or mid grade levels, we don't feel safe serving, because if we have a problem, we know it's not going, it might not get resolved in a fair way, or in a way that will ensure that all sides are heard. And
But this
Francesca,
is,
yeah, go ahead, Krista.
and I don't mean to interrupt, and I'm sorry, but and this is something where I tell people now, it's just that it's not all about, I respect your feelings and I definitely understand. And I always tell people self-care, 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 protect yourself, right? And if you're not feeling safe, then that's what you have to do. But at the same time, when it comes to me, I always tell people it's not about me anymore. Like, I have to be here to kind of help with these other people, because when I was in boot camp and that recruit ball cap became a Navy ball cap, and they started telling me about honor, courage, and commitment, I took that to heart. I took that to heart, and I took ownership to heart, because when I had Captain Amy Bauerschmidt, who's now Rear Admiral Bauerschmidt, and she told me about ownership was one of her tenets, I took those things to heart. And so, but that's where I'm not seeing that so much, and that's where I'm like, where did we lose this? And that's where I want to get that back.
Yes. And Francesca, let's get into solutions, because I think that's what we probably need to talk about more than whether or not enlisted get more justice than officers. I mean, who I don't know the answer to that, but let's talk more about solutions. What are some of the ways we can fix this?
Thank you. So I think first and foremost, like President Trump said, I believe a year ago, he came out on his one of his Truth Social, I believe, made an announcement that point number 6 of how he was going to fix the system is to have inspectors general be actually independent of the organization that they're told that they must inspect. The fact that inspectors general try to sell themselves as independent from their boss, the person who rates them and whose office is just down the hall from their office, is absolutely, it's just such a sham. It's a total sham. And so that's really the largest thing that needs to occur across the federal government. But of course, our foundation, we focus on within the Department of Defense and the Coast Guard, so that the military services. In the short term, of course, because I understand that's a potentially a big thing, although there's a lot of movement afoot going very quickly in the DC area. So who knows how quickly it could happen? I don't know. But other alternative options that we could see and would be helpful, at least, is that when a complaint is made, the complaint should be inspected by an entirely different unit at a minimum, or even better than that, by a different service. So essentially joint inspectors general. The other thing that we need to see, separate from having, fully separate or in the same, but kind of low-hanging fruit, is that there needs to be some sort of mandatory training, not just for real training, not just for people who are assigned as inspectors general, but also people who are assigned randomly as random officers or enlisted, assigned to do those.
Who get zero training right now.
Yeah, who get zero training. When I was part of General Carilla's team on the inspection team down at formerly Fort Hood, now Fort Cavazos, for one of the divisions down there for sexual harassment, sexual assault issues, I had zero investigatory training at all. And nobody on our team had any investigatory training, which is really pathetic. And then for Ryan, when he was an Air Force Inspector General, I think he said he had a full, 3 business days or 4 business days worth of training to be an actual Inspector General in the Air Force. And that's just ludicrous. The other thing we need to have some sort of mandatory timelines placed on these inspections, whether they're at the Inspector General level or at the command-led level. It is absolutely preposterous that you have investigations that can go on for years, literally years. The Red Hill fuel spill disaster, as an example, that investigation went on for 3 years. It's the spill occurred, at least the Navy admits, the spill occurred November 2021. The investigation from the DoD IG did not come out until November 2024. Coincidentally, almost immediately after there's a new administration in office, and the Secretary of the Navy would be stepping down because, of course, he's a political appointee. And so they're lame ducks. And the investigation itself is a sham. It's a cop-out. It's a total cop-out. It says, well, the Navy didn't have its SOPs in shape. Nothing to do with the multitude of leadership failures that occurred. So mandatory training, mandatory timelines of some sort, they need to be reasonably held to some sort of standard. A fully independent investigatory organization, both for the command level investigations as well as the IG level investigations.
Yes. And Krista, I'm going to turn this back over to you to kind of close out the call and to sort of wrap things up, because since this investigation happened on your case, I believe, if you can correct me if I'm wrong, it is still ongoing. Like it,
Yes, ma'am.
yeah,
Yes,
like
ma'am.
it came back unsubstantiated, then you appealed it, and then now the appeal is somewhere, and you're still just this one case. And
Yes,
you've even
ma'am.
gone on to another case where there was not lack of procedural compliance at another command. So this is something that is not just one command, one experience. You're seeing this throughout the DoD, not just even the Navy. Am I correct?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. And it's a systemic issue. And that's the issue that I have, is just that, why have policies if we're not going to follow them?
Right.
So
And I do agree. And I think that this is something that we've got to just keep the press on. We've got to keep sharing these stories. I will continue to talk about this until I'm blue or red in the face. I have a thing of where my face gets red now. So I'll keep talking about it until my face gets even more red, because it pisses me off and it needs to stop. And we need to get our legislators involved. We need to be loud. We need to become the media. As Francesca has done an amazing job of doing. If you listen to the Star Chamber podcast, you'll see it's doing what NPR or Frontline or one of these other places should be doing, but now we're doing it. We're doing it for the military, and we're bringing these stories to light, and we'll keep talking about them. We'll keep talking about them until we don't have to talk about them anymore, because that's what needs to happen. And so over to you, Francesca, for any closing words as we close out the call.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate it, Teresa. And I really appreciate you having Krista on today and then me on back in February of last year. It was my first podcast I ever did.
And I didn't know it was your first.
Yeah, that was the first one. So just in line with what you were just now saying, one final thought, if I could, please. So we have 3 branches of government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. The judicial branch of government, for the most part, is not available to military service members because of the Ferris Doctrine and then the added protection of the Westfall Act. The executive branch, which is, of course, where the DoD sits and where the Coast Guard sits, we are using all of the tools that are available within the executive branch, i.e. the administrative processes, the IG, the EO, the Article 138s, all these things. They're all coming back and punching us in the face. The other option that we have is the legislative branch. All that to say, for anybody who's experiencing these issues, anybody who knows who's experiencing these types of issues or will experience them in the future, you never know until it bites you in the butt.
Right, until it happens to you.
Do not hesitate to contact the legislative branch. Do not hesitate to file a congressional. You've got to use all of the tools available to you. And then on top of all of those is the press. The only thing that cockroaches will run from, they won't run from a nuclear blast, but they will run from the light.
They will. They will.
Are kind of bright. I get that. But my point is you got to shine a light on the cockroaches. You just have to. And the press and going to the media and going on the offense is the only way you regain the initiative, and the only way you regain any sort of control of your mental health and of your future.
Yep. And it's the way that you own your story. And speaking of owning your story, I'm going to close it over to Krista to bring this podcast home. So over to you, Krista.
I just want to end it to that person that's sitting and listening to this, or and say that that's going through something similar, that you are more than enough. You can fight this battle. If you need help, there are resources out there. We have Teresa, you have myself, you have Francesca with Walk the Talk Foundation. You are not alone. And please, if you ever feel that life is getting so hectic, please dial 988, the suicide prevention hotline. You are never alone. And so I just want to end it with that. So thank you so
Awesome.
much, Teresa, for this.
Thank you, Krista. Thank you, Francesca. I am going to go full screen on me and close out this call, and I will meet both of you backstage to say goodbye very quickly. But thank you all for taking the time to listen to this podcast. I know it was a very serious issue. I know that it is something that can change in time. I am hopeful that this new SecDef, who I advocated for and definitely sacrificed a lot to advocate for, will look at this issue, or his SecNav will look at this issue if on the Navy side. And I do believe that us advocates speaking up and sharing our stories will bring about the change that we need one day. So thank you all for joining us tonight. I will see you again next week. And as I always end these calls, take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and bye-bye now.